A man returns to his parents' home on break from his college classes. As he sits at his computer desk chewing a piece of gum, his mother hears a loud noise coming from his room a few moments later, and what she finds is horrifying, nothing anyone would expect, truly a parent's worst nightmare. A man was a daredevil his entire life, accomplishing some of the craziest and most dangerous stunts ever performed, but you will not believe what brings him to his end. A man is showing law students around the firm that he works at. As he is showing them around and the day is going very well, things take a sudden, tragic, unexpected turn as he decides to show them how safe the building is. And welcome to Dredge a Reality, where we talk about crazy facts, mysteries, and scary stories we've dredged from reality. Please subscribe to our channel, hit the bell notification and the like button so you don't miss any content we've dredged up for you. Most of my first videos have been mysteries where we go over theories and attempt to dig up the truth of what really happened. I will continue to do those videos as well, but today I'm going to start a new series called Bizarre Unalived, where we talk about the crazy off-the-wall ways people passed and the events leading up to their demise. In this series, I will usually do about 3 stories per video, possibly more. Please keep in mind, a lot of stories, especially the ones from way back in the day, a lot of times have conflicting information on small details. I have done my best to read as many articles and compare sources to come up with the most accurate version of events possible. They are still all very true stories, it's just some of the smaller details may vary from source to source, but the overall story is extremely accurate on events. Also, I added chapters so you can skip the story easily if needed. With that being said, I'm excited to bring this new series to you. It should be fun for the whole family. I'm totally kidding. Some of this can be very graphic and viewer discretion is advised. Now let's get to digging. On Friday, July 9th, 1993, in Toronto, Canada, a 39-year-old man named Garry Hoy was attending a reception with his colleagues at their office building welcoming law students for apprenticeship. Garry was a lawyer who worked at Holden Day Wilson at the Toronto Dominion Centre in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is a series of 5 financial district skyscrapers built in 1969. Garry was specifically in the Toronto Dominion Bank Tower, now the TD Bank Tower. Holden Day Wilson was a huge successful law firm in Canada, with over 90 successful lawyers working for them. Garry had worked for the firm since 1979. He was a specialist in corporate and security law. He also had an engineering degree and came from an engineering background before getting into law. He was separated from his wife and had no kids, so he really consumed himself and stayed focused on his career. He was well liked by all his colleagues and really good at his job. His colleagues said he was one of the best and brightest, truly a great guy. On that day, Friday, July 9th, during the reception, welcoming students interested in Holden Day Wilson apprenticeships, Garry decided he wanted to take the students on a tour of the building. He showed them around for a while, eventually taking the students to the 24th floor offices. Garry, having an engineering background, was interested in building safety and compliance, which made him want to show the students a trick. This trick was a trick Garry had performed many times before. He had done this several times without any issues. He wanted to show the students that the window on the 24th floor of the skyscraper was unbreakable. So Garry then stands back and lunges his 160-pound body full force into the window. He bounces off the window just like every other time he had performed the stunt, proving his point, demonstrating that the windows were unbreakable. After getting a few laughs and knowing the window was unbreakable, Garry decided he would try for a second time. He was having fun and wanted to show off for the students. So Garry steps a little further back this time and lunges full force into the window again. He was right, the window didn't break, but the frame did give way and the window detached from the building, causing Garry to fall to his death right in front of the students, his colleagues, and the busy street below. In 2013, a Reddit user named Robert D posted in a thread discussing the death of Garry on r/Toronto and provided his first-hand account of the event. Robert said, quote, I worked at the TD Tower when the guy bounced off of my window. I think if I remember correctly, he popped out of the 26th floor, and I worked at the TD Bank on the 10th. I didn't see him hit the window, but he left a blood smear, which tells me he must have cut himself going through the window. I was working, but my back faced the window, so the loud boom simply made me turn around to face a blood smear. My boss came into my cubicle to see what the loud noise was. He saw the blood too. He and I actually then both looked down at the same time. He too was pretty shocked. We actually never discussed that item even to this day. We're Facebook friends and keep in contact. He hit near one of the large blocks. Folks still sit on it, on the west side, in the courtyard area between what was CUT and TD, where the grass is. I only looked down for a brief second because I wasn't too far up and I could see it was very messy. There was a halo of blood around his head and then lines of goo spreading out from his body, which I later realized were his guts extending outward. Believe it or not, a tourist bus actually stopped on Wellington and people ran out and I could see some taking pictures. I didn't go down and left the building on the north side to avoid seeing it. Went over to a brew pub on Victoria and had a few drinks. Even today, when I cut through the courtyard, I look at that block. It is the first one you'd see coming from Wellington against the west side of TDT, end quote. This was very devastating and scarring to those who witnessed it. You have to remember that the district was extremely busy, so tons of people on the street, including his colleagues and students, saw everything. It was very distressing to many. A few days later, the firm hired Clark Institute of Psychiatry to give counseling to his colleagues at Holden Day Wilson, but over 30 lawyers still quit the firm after the event. Everyone was very mentally and emotionally scarred. Garry's death was not treated as suspicious. It was considered death by misadventure by police. Bob Greer, a structural engineer, was quoted saying, quote, "I don't know of any building code in the world that would allow a 160-pound man to run up against the glass and withstand it," end quote. I'm not gonna lie. Yes, I think it's smart not to throw yourself against a skyscraper glass, but I honestly figured it would be able to withstand the weight. I mean, code doesn't call for windows in a giant skyscraper to be able to withstand that amount of weight. Kind of scary, honestly. After Garry's death, things stayed very dismal around Holden Day Wilson. No one could get the tragedy out of their mind. This caused a decline in morale and incentive, causing the downfall of the firm. By 1996, the firm had completely closed its doors, with everyone claiming the reason to be because of Garry Hoy's death, which at the time was the largest law firm closure in Canada. On July 1st, 1908, a man named Bobby Leach stood on a bridge 200 feet above the Niagara River looking down. His heart began to race as he looked over to a crowd of around 3,000 people, anticipating what he was about to do. Bobby was standing on the Upper Steel Arch Bridge, also known as the Honeymoon Bridge, which was a steel arch bridge that spanned the Niagara River near Niagara Falls, connecting Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada to Niagara Falls, New York, United States. The bridge was later destroyed by a massive ice jam in the Niagara River in 1938, but was rebuilt and named the Rainbow Bridge, which opened in 1941 and still stands today. As Bobby was standing on the bridge, he took a deep breath and stepped to the edge of the bridge. He then looks over the horizon and jumps. Falling towards the river, he is caught by his parachute and glides past a cheering crowd of people. You see, Bobby was a stuntman / daredevil, and this was a stunt he did for Leo Stevens, who designed the parachute he was using. The parachute was attached to a pole in the center of the bridge, as Bobby sat on a small platform attached to the bridge. The wind blew the parachute from the fastening device twice before Bobby was able to jump, but being the brave stuntman Bobby was, he didn't care. Leo Stevens also had 2 advertisements sewn into the parachute, which yielded Bobby with $150. Not bad for a day's work in 1908. That would be equivalent to over $5,000 in 2025 if you adjust for inflation. Still not worth it to me. Bobby was born in 1858 in Cornwall, England. He was always an adrenaline junkie, always living life in a relentless pursuit of thrill. He was always looking to push his boundaries. Around 1880, when Bobby was around 23 years old, he moved to the United States to pursue a showmanship career. This is when he started looking for stuntman jobs, and finally he landed a break. Bobby ended up getting hired by the Barnum and Bailey Circus, a big circus that was founded in 1881 located in Bridgeport, Connecticut. It was one of the largest traveling shows in history at its peak. The Barnum and Bailey Circus featured over 1,000 performers and used 3 rings for simultaneous performances and had hundreds of animals including elephants, lions, tigers, and horses. The main tent, which was called Big Top, could hold 10,000 plus spectators at once. The circus was known as the greatest show on earth and was one of the first circuses to be founded in the United States. It was also the first to feature a freak show and wild animals. So this was a really big deal for Bobby. I mean, this was his opportunity to shine. When he joined the circus, he got into high diving and trick swimming. He was known for diving from platforms elevated up to 150 feet into pools only 5 foot deep. He performed death-defying dives for large crowds as they looked on in amazement. I mean, Bobby was extremely talented and good at what he did. During Bobby's time at the circus, he witnessed a fellow stuntman attempt to dive from a platform over 150 feet into a pool that was only 5 foot deep. The stuntman sadly did not survive this attempt and passed away. After observing his fellow stuntman pass away from this very risky stunt, Bobby attempted the stunt himself and succeeded. This skyrocketed his popularity, and he continued his stunt diving with the traveling circus until the early 1900s when he was around 50 years old. At this point, Bobby got tired of the traveling life and retired from the circus. He married a woman named Sadie, and they had a daughter together named Pearl. By 1908, they owned a restaurant together in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada. The name of Bobby and Sadie's restaurant isn't clearly documented in historical records, but some sources say it was called Bridge Street Tavern, located on Bridge Street in Niagara Falls. The street was situated right next to Niagara River, which divides Canada and the United States. Just because Bobby was tired of traveling and moved on from the circus didn't mean he was done with his stunts. He was an adrenaline junkie and performer that had this passion deep in his bones. He continued to do daredevil stunts as a passion and to make a little extra money. This is when in 1908 he made one of the more daring jumps from the upper steel arch bridge and parachuted down with the advertisements on his parachute. This moment is what started putting him into the spotlight and sparked him to continue to push his limits. Bobby ended up being intrigued by a woman named Annie Taylor, a school teacher from Auburn, New York. On October 24th, 1901, on her 63rd birthday, Annie became the first person to survive a trip over Niagara Falls in a barrel. A little background on Annie. She was a school teacher that had fallen on hard times after losing her home and money due to poor investments. This is when she decided she would be the first person to ride over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Her plan was to be the first person to do this, and then she would capitalize on her popularity by attending speaking engagements and exhibitions with her barrel. After successfully completing the stunt, her manager stole most of her money and ran off with the barrel. She spent the rest of her money hiring private detectives to find her barrel, and it was eventually found in Chicago, but disappeared again a short time later. Here's a picture of Annie Taylor right after completing the stunt. She spent the rest of her life posing with tourists at her souvenir stand and investing in the New York Stock Exchange. She died in 1921 at the age of 82, completely broke. But that's a story for another day. Back to Bobby. Bobby wanted to prove he could go off of Niagara Falls just like Annie. He often boasted to his patrons that he could surpass the feats of Annie. He would tell them anything Annie could do, he could do it better. Bobby continued doing his daredevil stunts over the years. In 1910, he started riding dangerous rapids below Niagara Falls in a barrel. He did this several times, but in June 1911, something went terribly wrong. The barrel that Bobby was in while he was riding those rapids below Niagara Falls got stuck in a whirlpool and started to fill with water. It was very difficult to rescue him in that situation without putting rescuers in great danger. Spectators became horrified as they saw the barrel turn completely over, covering the only air hole Bobby had. Rescuers had several unsuccessful attempts trying to rescue him for over 2 hours. They finally were able to pull him to shore. Fearing the worst, they opened the barrel and found Bobby unconscious inside. He was bleeding from his eyes, ears, and nose, but by some miracle he was still alive. The accident had happened on the last day of the International Niagara Carnival, with thousands of people showing up to watch the event. Bobby ended up making a full recovery, and just 1 month later started planning his biggest and greatest stunt yet, going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. This had not been attempted since Annie Taylor had went over the falls in 1901, but Bobby couldn't help himself. He had to top everything and everyone. This was a dangerous stunt and wasn't to be taken lightly. Annie Taylor even said, quote, "If it was with my dying breath, I would caution anyone against attempting the feat. I would sooner walk up to the mouth of a cannon, knowing it was going to blow me to pieces, than to make another trip down the fall," end quote. Most people thought Bobby was crazy trying to take this on. I mean, the man just escaped death and was already 53 years old. The newspapers even started referring to him as Old Bobby, but Bobby didn't care. Crazy bastard. Bobby's first barrel design was different than the wood and iron barrel that Annie Taylor used. He designed it to look more like a submarine. Here's a picture of him standing next to it in 1911, featured in the Illustrated London News newspaper. But Bobby didn't end up going with that design for unknown reasons. He ended up using a different design that looked more like a metal capsule made out of steel. It was roughly 7 foot by 3 foot wide, with padding lining the walls, wooden bumpers on the outside, and even a little viewing window. Bobby was to be strapped in a kind of string hammock to keep him from bouncing around inside. On July 25, 1911, Bobby put the barrel in the water about a mile upstream from the Horseshoe Falls, the largest of the 3 falls at Niagara Falls, at 168 foot tall. He was anticipating what he was about to do. This was extremely important to him. I mean, he wanted this to be the pinnacle of his career. There was also a ton of people there to see him. He shrugged off his nervousness and continued his mission. Bobby sealed himself inside and started his journey. He was going incredibly fast down the river, with the barrel sometimes being in the crest of a wave floating like a cork, but sometimes it disappeared beneath the surface, crashing into several big rocks on the way downstream. As Bobby approached the edge of the falls, the thousands of people watching went completely silent at once. The barrel then falls off the edge at 3:13 p.m. The only sound that could be heard was the roaring falls. Some people shouted, "There he is," as the barrel reappeared in the seething, bubbling waters below. But the main question at this point was, did he live? For 20 minutes after the barrel had hit the water at the bottom of the falls, the barrel floated around with no one able to pull it to shore. Finally, a man named Fred Bender waded into the river with a rope tied around his waist. Fred was able to grab the barrel with Bobby inside, and someone pulled the rope and brought them to shore. Once the barrel was on dry land, a local hotel owner named Harry Williams hammered on the barrel to attempt to open it. Everyone feared the worst. Bobby had been floating in the water for over 20 minutes. It was an extreme fall, and they hadn't heard a peep from him. But as Harry hammered on the barrel, everyone heard a hammer back from inside the barrel. This was a great relief, but what kind of shape was Bobby in after making that fall? Once the barrel was open, the first thing Bobby asked for was a cigar. I can't think of a more badass way to end this stunt. But Bobby didn't escape unscathed. He had a big gash on his forehead, a broken jaw, and both his kneecaps were broken. He spent over 6 months recovering after this stunt. Interviewed by reporters, he told them that he was the happiest man alive and that he had achieved the greatest ambition of his life. This is exactly what Bobby wanted, and he finally felt accomplished. In the years following the stunt, Bobby and his family traveled the world with the barrel used in the stunt, making public appearances and giving talks about the stunt. Being the adrenaline junkie Bobby was, by the time 1920 rolled around, he announced he was going to attempt the stunt again, but this time inside a giant rubber ball. But just a few days before this announcement, on July 11th, 1920, a man named Charles Stevens, a barber from Bristol, attempted the stunt making his own barrel, reinforcing it with an anvil as a ballast. Everyone thought this was a bad design and warned him not to do it. Against the advice of others, including Bobby, he tied himself to the barrel with a harness and attempted the stunt. As he went over the falls, the force ripped the barrel apart and the anvil broke through the bottom, pulling him out. Only his right arm, still strapped into the harness, was found. The rest of his body was never recovered. Sadly, Stevens became the first person to die attempting to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. After this tragedy, some people were suggesting that Bobby was callously attempting to cash in on a tragedy. According to Canada's Hamilton Daily Times, the date for Bobby's stunt was set for August 29th, 1920, but the date came and went with no sign of progress. Then 4 years later, in April of 1924, Bobby started making headlines again. Newspapers reported that he was in talks with a rubber company who was going to make him a rugby-shaped ball of huge dimensions for him to fit inside. The plan was again to have a hammock inside to ensure Bobby didn't hit the sides, and the papers reported that he expected it to be a comfortable ride. There was a problem for Bobby though. Both the United States nor Canada would give Bobby permission to launch his giant rubber ball from their bank, effectively banning his stunt. Bobby had a solution though. Since each nation wouldn't let him launch from their bank, he said he was going to have the giant ball dropped into the river from a plane. This was reported by numerous newspapers on July 25th, 1924. But by September of that year, Bobby seemed to have given up and set out for another tour with his barrel. One of his stops on his tour was in Auckland, New Zealand. While walking around the streets of Auckland, Bobby slipped on an orange pill and badly broke his leg. While recovering, he developed gangrene and died just a few days later. That's right, the man died because he slipped on an orange pill. He was 68 years old at the time. We are talking about a man who is an adrenaline junkie doing crazy and dangerous stunts his whole life. He dived into tiny pools from 150 feet in the air, parachuted off of bridges, sealed himself in barrels to go around whirlpools, and strapped himself into a barrel and rode off Niagara Falls, breaking his jaw and both his knees. But the man died because he slipped on an orange pill. The irony is just unbelievable with this one. The man survived so many daring stunts and then died from the most simple thing. Truly a crazy ending to a man who lived an extremely dangerous and risky life. On Sunday, December 6th, 2009, a short time after midnight in Konotop, Ukraine, a 25-year-old man named Vladimir Lakonos was sitting at his computer working at his parents' house on holiday from school. Vladimir was a chemistry student at the Kyiv Polytechnic Institute in Kyiv, Ukraine. He had traveled to Konotop, Ukraine to visit his family after the semester ended. Kyiv Polytechnic Institute is known for its engineering and technology programs. Vladimir had aspirations of becoming a scientist. Konotop was about a 3.5-hour drive northeast from the university, so Vladimir would drive home and stay with his parents after the semester ended. Vladimir had been doing some work Saturday night on his computer, and the night had bled into the early morning hours of Sunday. While at his desk, he pulls out a piece of gum and covers it in citric acid by dipping it in a packet he had on his desk. Vladimir would often chew gum, and he liked to dip it in powdered citric acid. Citric acid would give it a sour taste and prolong the flavor. Citric acid is used in many drinks and foods to add a sour taste. After Vladimir covers his chewing gum in citric acid, he tosses it into his mouth and returns to working on his computer. Moments later, his mother, that's in another room, hears a loud explosion coming from Vladimir's room. After hearing the explosion, his mother rushes into the room, and what she finds is not what any mother should find. Vladimir is lying on the floor, not moving. As she gets closer, she realizes that Vladimir's whole jaw and lower part of his face is completely missing. Panicked from the gruesome scene, his mother calls emergency personnel for help. When the emergency crew arrives to the scene, they do their best to attempt to treat his injuries, but sadly, they were unable to save him. Vladimir had passed away from his devastating injuries. But what happened? What could have possibly caused this? Investigators had the same question. As they look around the room for clues on what could have possibly happened, they spot a clue. 2 bags of white powdery substance on his desk. Fearing that the substances might be explosive from what had just happened, authorities decided to call in experts from Kyiv to travel to Konotop to test the substance. Authorities feared the substance would explode being transported to Kyiv. That's the reason they took this precaution. Experts found that one bag was citric acid and the other bag was an unknown explosive substance. The substance wasn't officially identified in reports, but it was reported as an explosive substance 4 times more powerful than TNT. You see, Vladimir would experiment with different chemical substances related to his chemistry studies. He had recently been working with explosive chemicals. One of those explosive chemicals was stored on his desk. Not only was it stored on his desk, but it was a white powdery substance in a bag, the same type of bag as the citric acid, which was also a white powdery substance. The 2 substances looked virtually identical. So what had happened? While Vladimir was sitting at his desk working away on his computer, he opened that piece of gum, grabbed a bag off his desk, and rolled his gum around in the substance. The problem is, since the 2 substances looked identical, he happened to grab the wrong bag which contained the explosive chemical substance. After rolling his gum around in what looked like citric acid, he popped the gum into his mouth and started chewing. As soon as he started chewing the explosive chemical, mixed with his saliva and the friction from chewing, the gum exploded. The explosion was so powerful it literally blew off his jaw and lower face, killing him instantly. As soon as he chewed it once, it was over. Some speculate the substance could have been an organic or pyrotechnic compound sensitive to heat, friction, or pressure because the act of chewing the gum caused it to detonate. However, due to lack of detailed forensic reporting and public accounts, the exact chemical remains unknown. Police spokeswoman Elvira Beganova describes it as being an accident that anyone could have made in the scenario. She said that the substances look virtually identical. She said, quote, "Even some of our seasoned officers who have seen a thing or two, even they were pretty shaken up by what they had found," end quote. The incident serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of experimenting with volatile substances outside of controlled environments. So that's the story of Garry Hoy, Bobby Leach, and Vladimir Lakonos. All crazy freak accidents that no one would have predicted. Except Garry Hoy. That one was pretty sketchy from the beginning. And also Vladimir. I guess putting explosive chemicals that look like your citric acid you dip your chewing gum in is pretty sketchy as well. It was pretty crazy that Bobby Leach did so many crazy stunts in his life and ended up slipping on an orange pill to meet his maker. So what did you think about these bizarre unalived stories? Do you have other crazy unalived stories you would like to share? Please let me know in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching, and please make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any reality we've dredged up for you. I'll see you next time with some more crazy facts, mysteries, and scary stories dredged from reality.